There is a specific kind of paralysis that has nothing to do with fear. You know exactly what needs to be done. You have the time. You have opened the document, the notebook, the application, whatever form the thing takes, and you're sitting in front of it and nothing is happening. Not confusion, not avoidance in the sense of wanting to escape, just a gap, a silent and specific distance between you and the task that no amount of intention seems able to close. You are fully aware that you should start. You are not starting, and the longer the gap extends, the more the gap itself becomes the primary thing. A texture of stuck that sits somewhere in your chest and doesn't respond to reasoning, to lists, to telling yourself that you'll feel better once you begin. You already know that. The knowing doesn't move anything. If you have ADHD and you were born in the Gen Z window, that experience is not a character trait. It is a measurable neurobiological state. And the science behind why it collided so specifically with your generation at this developmental moment inside this particular environment is more precise than most people have bothered to say clearly. The scale of who this is about is worth pausing on. According to CDC National Survey data, the rate of ADHD diagnoses among children and adolescents has climbed for more than a decade, with current estimates placing prevalence at roughly 1 in 9 school-aged children in the United States, a figure that continues to rise among the Gen Z cohort specifically. But the diagnosis number undercounts the actual reach of what's being described here. For every person with a formal diagnosis in this generation, there are others who recognize the pattern without the label. The chronic inability to begin, the gap between knowing and doing, the exhaustion of a brain that is clearly capable of focus in some conditions and consistently unable to produce it in others. The number is larger than the data captures, and the environment that shaped this generation made it larger still. Here's what nobody says clearly enough. The procrastination is not about effort. It is not about discipline or character or the absence of motivation in any ordinary sense of the word. Psychiatrist Russell Barkley spent more than 3 decades reframing what ADHD actually is, and his central argument, developed across decades of clinical research and peer-reviewed publications, is that ADHD is not primarily a disorder of attention. It is a disorder of self-regulation. More precisely, it is a disorder of the systems that govern executive function, the capacity to initiate action, sustain effort across time, manage emotional responses to unrewarding tasks, and deploy the kind of voluntary deliberate control over behavior that most people experience as nearly automatic. The attention piece is real, but it sits downstream from something more fundamental, a brain that does not reliably produce the neurochemical conditions required for voluntary action. Not because it cannot function, but because the activation system that most brains run without conscious effort requires, in the ADHD brain, a very specific set of inputs before it will fire at all. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because it changes the entire question. The question is not, why won't you start? The question is, what does your brain require before starting becomes neurologically possible? And whether those conditions exist in the environment you're being asked to perform in. Picture this. It is 2012. You are 11 years old. You have an ADHD brain, diagnosed or not, labeled, or just quietly described as the kid who loses things, who can't finish homework, who will spend 4 hours building something complex out of whatever materials are available, and then fail to write a paragraph about a book he genuinely liked. The brain is not broken. It is running a very specific search continuously for the input that produces activation. Novelty, challenge, unpredictability, something it doesn't already know the shape of. You find it in bursts, in games, in conversations that accelerate into something interesting, in the specific narrowing of focus that arrives when something catches. And suddenly the precision is there, and the people who watch you struggle 20 minutes ago are watching you function at a level that surprises them. The capacity was always present. It was just conditional on inputs that ordinary environments don't reliably provide. Then the smartphone arrives in your hands, and the search ends. What the feed delivers is not simply entertainment. For the ADHD brain, The architecture of an infinite scroll with variable reward intervals is something more specific than distraction. It is the neurochemical state that ordinary tasks couldn't generate, now available without friction, in the pocket, accessible at the exact moment the gap between you and the task becomes too uncomfortable to hold. The screen isn't pulling you away from something you wanted to do. It is offering the only input that currently produces activation in a brain that has been searching for it all day. The reason this is specific to Zoomers with ADHD, and not simply ADHD in any generation, comes down to the developmental window in which the two things intersected. Research on adolescent neuroscience has established clearly that the years between roughly 11 and 17 represent the most sensitive period for the calibration of reward processing patterns. During this window, the dopamine system is more reactive, more plastic, and more vulnerable to being shaped by whatever the environment consistently delivers. What the environment reliably rewards during that period tends to become what the brain expects and eventually requires in order to feel like engagement is possible. For previous generations with ADHD, adolescence happened inside structures with natural external friction, physical commutes, rigid class schedules, face-to-face social situations that demanded presence, environmental scaffolding that provided low-grade activation cues almost by default. The ADHD brain struggled significantly against those structures, but it was also being trained by them, shaped in some ways against its preferences, into the capacity to initiate within environments that didn't provide the optimal input. For Gen Z with ADHD, that critical developmental window landed precisely inside an environment built on the behavioral science of engagement maximization. Variable reward schedules, infinite scroll architecture, notification systems calibrated to interrupt at the frequency that produces maximum neurological response. Researchers Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge have each documented, through different methodologies and large-scale data sets, the degree to which this environment reshaped adolescent development across the Gen Z cohort. For the ADHD brain specifically, what that environment did during a plastic developmental window wasn't simply distract. It provided sustained training in what activation feels like and the source it reliably comes from. The pattern this produced has a name in the clinical literature. Thomas Brown, a clinical psychologist whose research on executive function extended Barclay's model across more than 2 decades of clinical practice, described what he called an activation deficit, the specific inability to initiate on demand for tasks that do not generate sufficient intrinsic engagement, independent of whether the person understands the task, wants to complete it, or knows the consequences of not doing so. Brown identified activation as the most foundational cluster of executive function impairment in ADHD, because without the capacity to begin, everything else is downstream and irrelevant. What the research shows consistently is that the ADHD brain activates on interest, novelty, challenge, urgency, passion, or mild anxiety, and that importance and intention by themselves do not reliably trigger the neurochemical conditions that make starting possible. This is why you can know, with complete cognitive clarity, that you need to begin and still find that beginning doesn't happen. The knowledge is present. The activation hasn't fired. These are separate systems, and treating them as though they are the same system is what produces the laziness misread every time. And here is the second mechanism, the one that operates underneath the first and almost never gets discussed directly, because the ADHD brain does activate under urgency. Anyone with ADHD who has ever produced functional, sometimes excellent work in a compressed panic before a real deadline understands this. The focus that arrives at 11 p.m. that was completely inaccessible at 2 p.m., the precision that appears under pressure when the same task was inert for hours. What urgency produces in those moments is not discipline. Urgency produces a cortisol and adrenaline response that temporarily generates the neurochemical activation state that ordinary initiation couldn't access through voluntary effort alone. The deadline doesn't motivate in the conventional sense. It creates a physiological trigger. And over years of consistently finding that the activation arrives under genuine crisis and not before it, the brain learns the pattern the way brains learn any reliable pattern. It begins to treat the crisis as a precondition. It waits, not from laziness, but from accumulated evidence that waiting is when the state that makes action possible finally appears. The result is a loop with a specific and self-reinforcing structure. No urgency present. The task won't activate, so the brain moves toward the feed, which provides a lower but available version of activation. The feed doesn't resolve the underlying incompleteness. The task is still there. The gap is still open. The gap generates low-grade anxiety. Anxiety builds until urgency reaches the threshold required for activation. Activation arrives. Work gets done, often under considerable pressure and sometimes with surprising quality. Urgency fades. Baseline returns. Loop resets. A generation of people who are not lazy, who are running a coping strategy that is internally coherent given what the brain has learned about when action becomes possible, and who have no reliable mechanism available to exit the loop from the inside. What COVID did to this specific population arrived on top of a system already under strain. When remote learning began in March 2020, the environmental structures that had been providing low-grade external activation, scaffolding for adolescents with ADHD, the physical commute, the class schedule, the social accountability of being visibly present with people who expected you to show up, disappeared simultaneously. Research tracking ADHD adolescents during pandemic remote learning, published across multiple journals covering child and adolescent psychiatry, documented significantly higher rates of academic disengagement and symptom worsening compared to neurotypical peers, not simply because of isolation, but because the external architecture that had been functioning as activation scaffolding was removed at the developmental window when internal capacity to replace it was still being formed. For Gen Z with ADHD specifically, the pandemic didn't interrupt a functional system. It removed the scaffolding from a system that had been depending on it more heavily than anyone had clearly named. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If you recognize this, not the laziness version of it, but the specific texture, the way the gap can extend for hours without closing, the way the work finally arrives in a burst of panic that is simultaneously productive and demoralizing, the way you know what you need to do with complete clarity and still find yourself unable to begin. You are not describing a failure of character. The loop you have been running is not evidence of insufficient effort applied to an ordinary problem. It is the predictable output of a specific neurobiological difference that developed inside an environment precisely engineered to intercept the signal your brain needed. During the years when your brain was most plastic and most shaped by whatever the environment consistently rewarded. Understanding the mechanism matters because it changes what you're actually trying to fix. Willpower applied to an activation problem doesn't solve the activation problem. It compounds the self-assessment damage without touching the underlying system. What the clinical research consistently points toward is not the elimination of all digital stimulation, which removes a coping mechanism without providing an alternative activation source, and not harder effort applied to the same stuck state. It points toward building deliberate environmental conditions that provide the preconditions for activation before the urgency arrives. Body doubling. Using social presence to generate the low-level activation scaffolding that external environments use to provide automatically. Implementation intentions. The specific if-then commitment structure documented by psychologist Peter Gallwitzer to substantially increase task initiation rates by reducing the neurological cost of beginning. Novel constraints inside the work itself, a changed location, a timer, a different medium, that provide enough of the novelty signal to engage the activation system without manufacturing an emergency to do it. None of this fires as cleanly as a crisis. None of it replicates the specific sensation of urgency-generated focus. It is slower, and it requires building a relationship with your own activation system through repetition rather than through panic. But it is the mechanism that makes starting possible on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing is on fire, which is most of your life. The procrastination that keeps returning is not evidence of what you lack. It is a rational response from a nervous system that was handed a specific set of developmental conditions and built the best available strategy for operating inside them. The strategy has costs you already know, but knowing what it actually is, not laziness, not weakness, but a coping architecture that made sense when it was built and has outlasted the conditions that made it necessary, is usually the first thing that makes it possible to build something that functions differently. If this gave language to something you've been carrying, if the gap between you and the task finally has an explanation that fits, say it in the comments. Not for me, but because naming the mechanism accurately is usually what makes it less adhesive. And if you know someone who gets called lazy when what they're actually running is this loop, send this without explanation. Sometimes that's the only message that lands. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.